The rain had been falling since early morning, turning the streets of the city gray and cold. Inside the emergency entrance of a large hospital, people hurried past one another. Doctors rushing between patients, nurses carrying files, and families waiting anxiously for news. Among them stood a young woman holding a small child tightly in her arms. Her name was Marissa Lane. Her clothes were worn and slightly torn at the sleeves, and her hair looked as if she hadn't slept properly in days. In one hand, she clutched a small stuffed teddy bear. In the other, she held her daughter close to her chest. The little girl's name was Sophie. Sophie was only 6 years old. Her face was pale, her breathing weak, and her tiny body trembled with fever. Marissa rushed to the hospital reception desk, her voice shaking. "Please, someone help my daughter. She's very sick." The nurse behind the counter looked concerned and quickly called a doctor. Within minutes, Sophie was taken to a small examination room. Marissa stood outside the door, pacing nervously. Every second felt like an hour. Finally, the doctor came out. His expression was serious. "Your daughter has a severe infection," he said gently. "She needs immediate treatment." Marissa nodded quickly. "Yes, please. Do whatever you need to do." But the doctor hesitated. "The treatment is expensive," he continued carefully. "Without payment, we can't begin the procedure." Marissa felt as if the ground disappeared beneath her feet. "How much?" she asked in a weak voice. The number the doctor told her was more money than she had ever seen in her life. Her hands began to shake. I don't have that kind of money," she whispered. The nurse behind the counter sighed softly. "I'm sorry," she said. "Hospital policy requires a deposit before treatment." Marissa's eyes filled with tears. She looked through the small window of the room where Sophie lay on the hospital bed, weak and struggling to breathe. Suddenly, Marissa dropped to her knees. "Please," she cried. "She's my only child. I'll do anything. I'll work. I'll clean. I'll pay you back somehow. Just please save my daughter." People in the waiting room turned to watch. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked uncomfortable. But no one moved at that exact moment. A tall man in a dark suit walked down the hallway. His name was Adrian Cross. Adrian Cross was one of the richest men in the country. His companies owned hotels, technology firms, and investment companies worth billions of dollars. He had come to the hospital that morning for a meeting about funding a new medical research wing. Normally, Adrian's days were carefully planned: meetings, business deals, flights on his private jet. But today, something unexpected stopped him. He heard Marissa's voice. Her desperate cry echoed through the hallway. Adrian slowed his steps. Then he turned and looked toward the reception area. He saw a mother kneeling on the floor, crying and begging for help, and in that moment, something inside him shifted. He walked closer. Marissa was still pleading. "Please, don't let her die." Adrian looked through the window at the small girl lying on the hospital bed. She looked so small, so fragile that in her tiny hand, she was holding a worn teddy bear. Adrian suddenly felt a wave of memories rushing back. Memories he had buried for years. When Adrian was a child, he had grown up very poor. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. There had been nights when she pretended she wasn't hungry so Adrian could eat. He remembered one night when he had been sick as a child. His mother had carried him to a clinic, begging the doctor to help even though she couldn't afford the bill. A stranger had stepped forward and paid for his treatment. Adrian had never forgotten that moment. But over the years, success had slowly buried those memories under business deals and wealth. Until now. Adrian turned to the nurse. "What's happening here?" he asked calmly. The nurse explained the situation. "The child needs treatment, but the mother can't afford the deposit." Adrian looked at Marissa. Her face was wet with tears, but her eyes were filled with fierce determination. The determination of a mother who refused to give up. Adrian made a decision. "Start the treatment immediately," he said. The nurse looked confused. "But sir, the payment?" "I'll cover all of it," Adrian said firmly. The nurse's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Adrian nodded. "Every expense, whatever the child needs." The nurse quickly rushed to inform the doctors. Within minutes, medical staff hurried into the room to begin treatment. Marissa looked up at Adrian in disbelief. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you do this for us?" Adrian paused. Then he looked at Sophie through the glass window. "Because every child deserves a chance to live," he said softly. Hours passed. Marissa sat in the waiting area, nervously twisting her hands together. Adrian remained there as well. Sitting quietly nearby at IT was the first time in years he had simply sat still without checking his phone or worrying about business. Eventually, the doctor returned. He had a small smile on his face. "The treatment is working," he said. Marissa burst into tears of relief. "Thank you," she whispered. But Adrian wasn't finished helping. While they waited for Sophie to recover, Adrian spoke with Marissa. He learned about her life. She worked 3 cleaning jobs. She had no family support. Rent took almost all her money. Many nights she skipped meals so Sophie could eat. Adrian listened quietly. The more he heard, the more he admired her strength. Finally, Adrian made another decision. "I'd like to offer you a job," he said. Marissa looked confused. "A job?" "Yes," Adrian said. "My foundation helps struggling families. We need someone who understands their challenges." Marissa stared at him. "You want me to work for your foundation?" Adrian smiled slightly. "Yes, flexible hours, good pay, and health insurance." Tears filled Marissa's eyes again. "I don't know how to thank you." Adrian shook his head. "You don't need to thank me." Then he added something else. "I've also created an education fund for Sophie. When she grows up, college will already be paid for." Marissa covered her mouth in shock. "You're giving her a future." Adrian looked thoughtful. "Someone once gave me a chance when my mother had nothing," he said quietly, "and that changed my entire life." Days later, Sophie recovered enough to leave the hospital. Her cheeks had color again. She held her teddy bear tightly as she walked beside her mother. Before leaving, she looked up at Adrian. "Thank you for helping me," she said shyly. Adrian knelt down and smiled. "You're welcome, Sophie. Will you visit me again?" she asked. Adrian nodded. "Of course." As Marissa and Sophie walked out of the hospital together, the rain had stopped, sunlight broke through the clouds, and for the first time in years, Marissa felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Adrian watched them leave. For the first time in a long time, he felt something too. Not pride, not success, but purpose. He realized that wealth meant very little if it wasn't used to change lives, and sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was simply choose to care. The hours that followed felt longer than any Marissa had ever experienced. She sat in the waiting area, staring at the floor, her hands trembling as she replayed every moment that had led her there. The doctors and nurses moved quickly through the hallways, their footsteps echoing against the white walls. Every time the operating room doors opened, Marissa's heart jumped, but each time, it wasn't the news she was waiting for. Adrian sat quietly across from her. Normally, his phone would never leave his hand. His assistants were used to him responding to emails within seconds. But today, his phone remained untouched on the table beside him. For the first time in years, business didn't feel important. Instead, he found himself thinking about his childhood. He remembered the small apartment where he grew up, the cracked windows that let cold air inside during winter, and the way his mother worked late into the night sewing clothes for extra money. She had always told him one thing, "Adrian," she would say, "when life becomes good for you, never forget people who are still struggling." Back then, he had promised he wouldn't forget, but somewhere along the road to success, that promise had faded. Until today. Across the room, Marissa suddenly spoke. "I'm sorry you had to see all of that," she said quietly. Adrian looked up. "You don't have anything to apologize for?" he replied. Marissa shook her head slightly. "It's just, I never imagined my life would become this difficult." She stared down at her hands. "I used to have plans. I wanted to become a teacher. I loved working with children." Her voice softened. "But when Sophie's father left, everything changed." Adrian listened carefully. Marissa continued. "I took whatever jobs I could find, cleaning offices, restaurants, houses, anything that paid enough to keep a roof over our heads." She looked toward the hospital room where Sophie was being treated. "But no matter how hard things became, I promised myself I would never give up on her." Adrian nodded slowly. "That promise makes you stronger than most people," he said. Marissa looked surprised. "You really think so?" "I know so," Adrian replied. Just then, a nurse walked by and offered them both cups of coffee. Marissa wrapped her hands around the warm cup, trying to calm her nerves. Hours later, the doctor finally returned again. This time, his expression looked far more relaxed. "The infection is responding well to the treatment," he said. Relief spread across Marissa's face like sunlight breaking through clouds. Her shoulders dropped as if a huge weight had finally lifted. "Thank you," she whispered again. Adrian watched the moment quietly. He realized something simple but powerful. For Marissa, this wasn't just about money. It was about hope. And hope was something no one should ever have to beg for. Later that evening, the doctor allowed Marissa to visit Sophie. Adrian waited in the hallway while mother and daughter reunited. Through the glass window, he could see Sophie smiling weakly as Marissa hugged her gently. The little girl whispered something that made Marissa laugh through tears. Adrian didn't know exactly what Sophie said, but he knew that moment, simple and quiet, was more valuable than any business deal he had ever made. When Marissa stepped out of the room again, she looked like a completely different person. Exhausted, yes, but hopeful. She asked if the nice man who helped her was still here. Marissa said softly. Adrian smiled. "Well, I suppose I should say hello then." When he entered the room, Sophie looked up at him curiously. "You're the man who helped my mommy?" she asked. Adrian nodded. "Yes, I am." Sophie smiled and held up her teddy bear. "Mr. Teddy says thank you too." Adrian laughed quietly. "Well, you're very welcome, Mr. Teddy." the room filled with gentle laughter. And in that moment, Adrian realized something he hadn't felt in a long time: happiness that didn't come from wealth, happiness that came from helping someone who truly needed it. It was simple, but it was real, and it reminded him that sometimes the greatest change in the world begins with just one small act of kindness.